Perfect. So it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Liadsky from Purpose Analytics, who will be talking to us about tracking Toronto's supply of affordable rental. And I'll stop sharing and I'll hand it over to you, Daniel.
Great, thank you so much. Let me switch to my presentation here. All right. There we go. And I realized I think that the title that we provided was something like tracking the supply of affordable rental. And I think it's because we didn't have enough characters for our very long project name, but I do want to just clarify that I guess we will say it's an estimate, as you'll soon see. So looking forward to going through this with you. I also just want to say, very pleased to attend Civic Tech Toronto for the first time. When I was invited, I thought, perfect. I've got plenty of time to attend a few before the presentation, and time went by, and I guess here I am. It's still my first time, so glad that I finally made it, and hope I'll be able to attend others in the future. Okay, so just very quickly about Purpose Analytics. We're, I guess, a relatively new shop serving the nonprofit sector. I'm sure many of you have had seen presentations from other nonprofits and can imagine some of the needs of that sector. Some of them are universal, and some of them are certainly specific to them. And so we do a fair bit of a variety of work, working directly with nonprofits. This presentation is more of about a standalone project that we're doing. So it's sort of separate from sort of most of our day-to-day work. Okay, so I'll jump right into to what it is that we're trying to do. And I think everyone, it's hard, especially during the pandemic, not to have paid attention to what's happening in the housing market. And I think some of the challenges is we hear a lot of stories, especially about what's happening with rental. And the stories are very powerful, and they certainly tell us that something is happening. But it's hard for us to put a number on it. And so that's really what we're trying to address here. This idea that affordable, especially deeply affordable rental is leaving urban centers in Canada. In this case, we're focusing on Toronto. And how is it possible for us to put a number on it? And, I think this is one of those stories of where in the future we can imagine that all the administrative data that we would need to answer this question would be available to us, but we're not there yet. So what the project is attempting to do is to try to make an estimate in the absence of the availability of the data that we need. And I think as I go through, some of you will be aware of some of those data sets that might be, I guess, currently behind a lock and key. Hopefully for not too long, but and sometimes for good reason, but definitely not available to us at the moment. And I actually sort of just personally, I think some of the work that we do at Purpose Analytics is trying to get data out of weird systems, and for, I guess, some perverse reason, I really get a kick out of those projects. So I don't know if I look forward to a world where all the data is available at our fingertips. It's sort of an entertaining challenge to try to find creative ways to get to data that we don't have. Okay, so we're calling this project the Low End of Market Rental Housing Monitor. It's just a little bit of information about it. It's funded through Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, and they have a challenge series called the Housing Supply Challenge, and this is one of 6 challenges. So we're part of the data-driven round. And I think what's interesting about challenges or a challenge format is it gives us the latitude to explore a little bit. We can be a bit experimental, and I mean, they're hoping, and we're hoping that we don't have a failure, but there's a scope for that, as opposed to a typical granting arrangement where you have a really firm commitment to create a deliverable. Our deliverable here in this case is to make the attempt at doing this estimate and try to make something, regardless of the outcome, that will be useful to people in working in housing in cities. So just to clarify that this project and the presentation is focusing on Toronto. We're in this proof of concept stage for the funding. we will be eligible to apply for a next round. And if we're successful, we can scale this project up in other urban centers. And I also just want to highlight our great team that's listed below. I think one of the real exciting parts about this project is just getting to work with these team members. So, it's hard for me to jump right into the project without doing a little bit of a housing 101. So I'll try not to bore you too much with this, but this is not a perfectly correct conceptual model, but I think might resonate with many of you, especially if you've been a renter. And it's just sort of showing that this notion that affordability in the rental market is really a function of age. So units age into affordability. The new units tend to be more expensive, and the longer they're around, the more affordable they get. We sometimes lose units, and that can be through conversions, like in a condo market. You can have a unit that's owned by someone and they decide to rent it and then they decide to live in it. And units can also be lost through a process that's, I guess, commonly called now upscaling, and that's sort of those blue dotted arrows just showing units that get to a state where sort of major capital improvements are required, and that sort of bumps them up. They sort of become as new or like new compared to their earlier state, and that can take units out of this sort of deeply affordable range. So just going on with our housing 101, it's good to know that there are also some segments in the rental market. Primary rental is what we would think of as apartment buildings, and there are regulations that preserve apartment buildings as rental. So an apartment building can't easily be converted to condo. An apartment building can't easily be demolished without replacement. So you see the little circular arrows there with the X through it. That's sort of showing that those units actually stay in the rental market and they're protected through legislation. Then there's this notion of the secondary market, and that's where you can have owners who own condos or houses and decide to rent them. And so you can see there's an X on the circular arrows there because those units can come in and out of the market depending on what the owner wants to do. And then there's this area that I like to think of as the non-market area. So, when I use the terminology affordable, I guess I'm using like a lowercase a affordable. I'm talking about affordable from a financial or dollars and cents perspective. There's also this sort of capital A affordable, which is units that are guaranteed to be affordable through agreements with the city or provincial funder or federal funders. So those capital A affordable, you can see I have a little pumpkin above there. They're often time limited. So the affordable rentals are protected for the duration of the agreement. Sometimes they're 25 years, sometimes they're 99 years. So eventually they may revert back to market or turn into a pumpkin in my mind. But the other kinds of non-market, non-profit or co-op or social housing, those are sort of special classes that stay protected. So the thing that we're focusing on is this yellow box. We're really focused on the market part of the rental housing market. For one reason, that the non-market is small, so you can actually count the number of social housing units and you can count the number of co-ops, so we don't need to do an estimate. On the private market side, it's a little bit different because the units are changing as well, that we don't really know as much information, or the data is not as transparent. So that's sort of where we're focused. And you can see I have these sort of different length bars, and the condo one doesn't quite go into the low end of market box. And that's sort of just acknowledging that condo tends to stay more in the more expensive rent thresholds. And there are cases where condos are deeply affordable, but not as common. Okay, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide with a lot of words, but just to acknowledge that there's like a policy context, especially around the Landlord-Tenant Act. And if you're sort of curious about how rent control works or above guideline increases, and just understanding the stories you hear about evictions, these all fall under this act. And the real key thing here for us is mostly around the rent control. and that a unit is only controlled while a tenant remains in it. So as soon as a tenant leaves, unless the unit was built after November 2018, that unit can revert back to market prices. So we're particularly interested in units that are deeply affordable, regardless of whether the tenant has been in there for a long time and sort of been benefiting from rent control. So what are the units that are low cost, deeply affordable, regardless of this rent control application? So another important part is just to help define what is low end of the market, and we realized very early on that we could spend a lot of time on this. I think really the key part is that when we talk about deeply affordable, we're talking about rents that are meeting the needs of the sort of lower end of the household income spectrum. And when you get to that level, you really start to lose choice about where you live. And I think that's what we're concerned about is when you start to squeeze out the bottom end of the household income spectrum, they may have to live elsewhere. They may, if people can't find a place for themselves in the city and they have to live outside of the city, that has implications for a city that, well, A, is welcoming to everyone, but B, meeting the needs of a city which has a spectrum of workers who need a spectrum of housing. So lots of reasons, I think, why it's important and sort of plain language about deeply affordable. But we did realize we had to settle on some tangible thresholds. So what you see here in the table are some thresholds that are proposed by the City of Toronto. They're not quite yet have come into effect, but it seems like they likely will. And there are thresholds that the city will use to negotiate with developers around guaranteeing affordable units in new developments. And so what they do is they take 30%, you may be familiar, 30% of your income is considered to be sustainable, affordable costs or portion of your income to spend on rent. When you go above that, you're considered to be you're considered to be more at risk. I think if you're renting in Toronto, most people are well above 30%. And you can see the numbers that are in these thresholds will probably feel very low for people who are renters in Toronto. So it might be hard to imagine a one-bedroom unit actually going for $495. And so this partly tells us how far out of line the housing costs are relative to what's considered to be affordable. But we do believe that there are some units that do fit in these thresholds. And so this is what we're looking for, this sort of smaller slice of the rental pie. So, what we're trying to do here is determine what is the supply. So we need to figure out, well, how do we find this low end of market? And we're interested not just at like a current snapshot, like where are we at now, but really how has it changed over time? And when it's changed, has it moved as well? So, if you are a longtime resident of Toronto, you'll know that a lot of affordable units used to be in the center of the city. And now I think it's sort of commonly accepted that that's probably not the case. And most of these units have moved to the inner suburbs. So our approach here is to start with census data. If you filled in the long form, you know that there's a question there about rent. Through a custom tabulation, we can filter out some of the things that are not of interest to us. So rent-controlled units, for example, we can filter out just those units of people who recently moved, for example, to get that asking rent. And we can also filter out subsidized units, so we can stay within the private market. But once every 5 years so that would be great for a baseline, but getting a cut once every 5 years is not enough to keep up with market changes. And if you've been following the rental market, even just during the pandemic, there's signs of, we don't know if it's temporary, but there's signs of a softening. If you're looking for an apartment now, some would argue that it's a renter's market after a long time not being a renter's market. And that's a change in the last 12 months. So what we're interested in is if we can use the census to provide these endpoints for us, can we find other data sets that help to anticipate or explain the change that was happening in the intercensal periods? And so what are those data sets? So we don't really know the answers to these questions. This is what we're doing right now, is doing the exploration. And we suspect that these indicators of change will be different for each subtype. And so you can see I've highlighted a few different subtypes here. I've especially highlighted rooming houses as its own thing as well. And you can see that underneath that are some data sets that we're suggesting might inform our understanding of what's changing in those markets. And just to give you a little bit more of a background, the primary market, those apartment buildings, many of them are owned by, well, there's sort of two owners. Historically, there were a lot of family-owned companies that owned apartment buildings, and now there are larger investors that are getting into the market and buying up those buildings. And so those changes in ownership tend to have there tends to be a relationship between changes in ownership and building level improvements that happen. Some of those can lead to escalating costs. So that's something that's very specific with the primary market. Secondary market can include people renting out houses, but it also includes all the basement apartments that people have built over the years. And even in my neighborhood, when I walk down the street, I see a lot of people digging out their basements over the pandemic. I don't know if that's for a tenant or for themselves, but looking at the creation or deconversion of those basement units is an important indicator. As we know, basement units tend to be cheaper than other units, so they're an important source of deeply affordable housing. And the rooming house picture is very, I guess, specific to Toronto. Rooming houses right now are only formally licensed in the former city of the old city of Toronto. So in Etobicoke and North York and Scarborough and York, they're technically considered to be illegal. But as we know, those rooming houses do exist, and there are some markers that of their existence. They do come into contact with the city, and the city's not interested in trying to dehouse people. So if it's an illegal rooming house, the approach is not to shut them down. And certainly there actually is some active work right now on legalizing them across the city. I believe there's actually a vote coming to council tomorrow, which may or may not get passed around this important issue. Okay, so that's the Housing 101. Sorry to take up so much time for that. So I just wanted to share a bit of a screenshot of what we're hoping our tool will look like. So an important part of this is making the data accessible, so packaging it into something that's user-friendly, map-based tool. So you can sort of just see some examples here of how the tool will present information, showing some neighborhood level details as well, perhaps some building level details if we have them, as well as we have the opportunity to incorporate all the additional data layers that we've been ingesting as part of this data exploration. And what's nice about that is they come spatially joined, so people can take them without that effort of having to align addresses and locations. And they can take that data and make use of it themselves afterwards. I thought I would just, we're still in the middle of this project. It will wrap up in September. We don't have our custom tabulations yet from Stats10, so we're waiting on some critical pieces of information. But I thought I would just share a couple of preliminary findings that we thought were interesting, and I think demonstrate that this exploration is still bearing fruit, even if we don't have an estimate yet to share. So this is a series of maps from the city planning building permits data set, and we were looking for those secondary suites. Now, I don't want to make concrete statement here that what we're seeing is not just a change in the way that the city was tracking things over time, but it does appear that the number of secondary suites constructed and grew enormously over the last 20 years. And it's maybe not surprising that when we think of the rise of Airbnb during between 2016 and 2021, that those numbers might be rising. So that's just one sort of quick tidbit. Another one is just looking at above guideline increase requests. So this is when a landlord has a sort of extraordinary cost associated with the building. They can go to the landlord tenant board and request that the tenants pay up to 3% over the regulated amount. So the map here shows all the above guideline increase requests in blue. The City of Toronto has a program called the Tenant Defense Fund, which provides grants for tenants who want to organize to challenge or contest these applications. And so what we see is about a quarter of these buildings are taking up this grant. So, this could provide useful information for the city in evaluating the success of a program. Lastly, and I won't put this as a slide, but maybe I'll share a finding that was maybe a little bit of a failure. And when I share it, it probably won't come as a surprise. One of the things we investigated was a microdata file with StatsCan. That's the Canadian Housing Survey. And one of the associations in this microdata file, and you use these microdata files just to understand data sets better, and then you can go look at the sort of complete data set. But the microdata file identified that areas that had lower rents people who lived in them tend to have lower opinions or lower perceptions of the cleanliness of their neighborhood, and complaints about graffiti, those sorts of things that we might not be surprised about. So we thought, great, we'll take the 311 data set, which is the City of Toronto's phone line where you can make service requests about litter and graffiti, and we'll take a look and see if that aligns. And this won't come as a surprise probably, but the highest complaints were actually in probably the more well-to-do neighborhoods. And so the 311 data set's really probably measuring the neighborhoods that complain the most, rather than the neighborhoods that have perhaps the most service needs, and those complaints just aren't being registered. So that's a data set that we probably won't be able to use in the way we hoped. And I think that sort of covers our project, and just wanted to acknowledge CMHC for the funding, and look forward to any questions that you might have about the project.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Do you mind if we continue recording through the Q&A? We can also turn off the recording if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue. If I have anything really controversial to say, I'll ask.
Perfect.
How's that?
Perfect. You can also ask us to cut it out after the fact if you realize hindsight's 2020.
Right.
For everyone who would like to ask questions about this fantastic presentation, also thank you for the 101. It's always great to have kind of groundwork to build off of. Please, anyone put a Q in the chat and we'll go through those questions. I see Brent had put one in earlier, so I'm going to start there. Have you thought of organizations to partner with to fight for open data? Rent is not cheap when collecting ODSP. Can we fix this?
Yeah, yes. And so, the challenge with this project is the proof of concept. So we're trying to, I guess, model what we would do when we go to sort of a larger implementation. So we do see this project as both a data this project, I guess a software development or like a tool development project, but there is an engagement component. And so we do have a couple of engagement team members who are speaking with not just the city and researchers, but we do have an advocates and activists focus group that we're conducting. So, our interest here is to create a tool that will be useful to as many groups as possible, but also, I guess, coherent as well. So it can't be everything to everyone, but focused enough that the different groups can use it. And I think one of the things we know is going to come out of this is we're going to be able to identify the roadblocks in finding the information that we need to make this estimate. And fortunately and credit to CMHC, that's in scope with the projects. We're not being that, we fully intend to have a section of our tool that will discuss this, and will identify the data sets that if they were open or made available in some way, that we'd be able to do a better job. We wouldn't have to twist ourselves in knots making these estimates. So that's definitely on the agenda, and it's both about making open data open, but also making data available that perhaps can't be open, but should be accessible for these sorts of projects.
Great. And I see, John, you have a question.
Actually, I have two. They're more or less linked. The first one is, I was just curious about your definition of deep affordability, because in my experience, deep affordability has two kind of connotations. One is the actual affordability of the unit, and the other is some kind, not guarantee, but some kind of at least reasonable possibility of tenure. A unit is not deeply affordable if, for example, 2 years after it's built, the rent all of a sudden increases very considerably, as has been known to happen when landlords get funding for construction on the basis that they're going to offer affordable rent units, and then decide that the bidding wars are just too tempting. And the other is like that the obstacles to affordability, in my experience, are not purely economic. They're also artifacts of deliberate attempts to keep people in certain socioeconomic classes out of buildings. And I'm sure you've had that experience. You've encountered that. In my experience, there are definitely places that simply do everything they can not to rent to people on ODSP or OW. So sorry to hit you with two questions at once,
Yeah.
but I think they're linked.
Yeah, so the first one is really about these two notions of deeply affordable. And it's there's kind of two parts to this. I think one is, we're not, our purpose analytics itself is, we're not really embedded in the housing sector, and so we're trying to align the tool with what people who are working in housing will find useful, right? So in some ways we're trying to sort of let people like you or people that we're engaging to tell us what's needed, right? And then we can see if it's addressable through the data that's available. So I guess that's, I don't know, I'm not trying to skirt that question too much, but just to say that, we're looking for where the deeply affordable is, and then how people will use that information, I think is really, we're putting it in their hands how to use it. Purpose analytics, I guess we see ourselves as sort of just making that information available. So I think your other question was around sort of discrimination and exclusion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a really interesting one. And one of the data sets that I don't think we will be able to get in this round, but what we imagine is that there could be an opportunity to shine a light on this data access problem, and that with a little bit more time and relationship building, we could move towards accessing other data sets. So when it comes to social assistance, so on Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Program, both of those programs actually ask recipients how much rent they pay. And we don't have access to that right now. Ontario Works is probably a bit more accessible because it's administered through the city. And I could imagine it could be possible to create a relationship, like develop a partnership with the city around those data sets. ODSP is a little bit trickier because that's at the provincial level, and sort of really accessing that would be difficult. But you could imagine if you had access to that information, you could literally look at where do people receiving ODSP who live in the city, and you can answer those questions about where do they not get of and why. So I think that the data exists to answer that question. Whether we can access that right now is the challenge. I don't know if did that answer your question?
It's very interesting. I think there are definitely issues with using that data for ODSP, because I happen to know that ODSP asks for a budget for rent, even when they're covering the needs of severely disabled people that are living with a family member.
Yeah.
So you're going to get contamination from ODSP applications where the rent is simply pro forma. The rent is certainly not market, and it's not a unit, but it is necessary. The rule is that it has to be asked about, so it is.
Yeah.
It's all that data, of course, is going to be very, very tricky to deal with, but I know for a fact that there's an artifact in ODSP that makes it particularly difficult.
Yeah, I can appreciate that for sure. I think there's also the other issue of how do you how do you access and deal with that data respectfully? It's personal information, and it's personal information that isn't sort of universally being accessed, right? Like, we don't all have to submit our rent somewhere. So, because you're receiving Ontario Works or ODSP, should your data be harvested for these purposes as well?
Thanks. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to only take the next 3 questions, but I will try and close out the Q&A by 7:55. And Adam, your question's up next.
My question is more of a comment, so I will just make it quick. And I think all the other people are basically said this, and I will say it this way. When you're working on your project, every time you see one of those accessibility symbols around, remind yourself that accessibility is one of those things that is also it's hard for people with physical disabilities that aren't necessarily working in that aren't necessarily in the public housing system to find housing. And it's also why some working people with disabilities are bunging up the public housing system because they feel like they need to stay there in order to get affordable, accessible housing. So I just want you to know that if this project does really get off the ground and you're like, accessibility isn't an issue we need to deal with, I'm telling you, it is going to be the important issue as people age down the road. End of thought.
Yeah, and I think so. We're one of 21 projects, and there actually is a project focused on looking for data sets that speak to the supply of accessible units. So it is a focus. I think and you're absolutely right. It's going to be very important as people age at home. It's hard to imagine people after the pandemic wanting to go to long-term care. So you're going to have even more people trying to stay at home. And yeah, and so hopefully their project is successful in identifying data sets and can continue to go to the next round as well.
Thanks. And Jim, you're up next.
Hi, Jim Rutham. I have the like the fundamental issue with affordability is, like in the private market, is the private market has no incentives to make things affordable. And so nowhere that relies on the private market has affordable housing. And Toronto's just one of that group. One of the questions I had about the nature of your project is, what did you do when you were trying to set it up, if anything, to work out how effective this would be in ultimately delivering affordable housing?
Well, so yeah, and again, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but because we don't consider ourselves to be the housing experts, I guess, and we're looking to put this information in the hands of housing experts. I think maybe a simple example is, there's been a lot of emphasis on building and creating new supply. And I'm not going to pretend that that's not important or contest that. And that includes new supply of affordable rental. But the challenge with that is, if we disregard the preservation of the units that might be affordable, then we've got a sort of mismatched policy. So, I think our consideration here was, can we tell the story is that, in that first conceptual model, the bottom falling out faster than things are falling onto the top is really what we're trying to answer. And if we can shed some light on that, that might trigger some different thinking, I guess, with decision makers.
Cool. And the very last question from Peter. Are you aware of recent news about developers scooping up huge potential areas for redevelopment? And if so, what's your group feeling? Concerned? And if I can add like a little addendum to that question, I'm also curious like how you're maybe acknowledging or not acknowledging like data about future developments, which might be more like speculative data.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're very interested in ownership. That information is not necessarily readily available, or it's semi-available, especially ownership of properties that are not existing housing units. So like land that's not developed to its, I guess. There's one of, I guess, the inspirations for this project is a New York City project called the Displacement Alert Project. And they have like a parallel project called Who Owns What? And they've done a very good job of identifying ownership. And so you can see the consolidation of properties by different companies. The data landscape in the US is very different from here. There's certainly different notions of privacy. So I don't think we'll be able to quite do that, but the city does have detailed information about ownership, or at least property management for apartment buildings. And we're quite interested in whether there's a story over time. Do you see over time consolidation, among the big investors, and what's that doing to the units and those buildings. And I would say I've heard lots of anecdotal stuff about developers things. So lots about Metrolinks. I don't know if any of it is true, but I've heard stories, right? So can we put some numbers on these things that we understand whether it is happening, or, well, it's probably happening, but to what extent is it happening, and is it a threat or not?
Cool. Thank you so much.
Could I ask a second question?
Only if it's very, very short and a follow-up.
Yeah, very quickly, Daniel.
Sure.
Maybe if this is a threat to your project, infringing on your target market, I think while you are preparing for this project and trying to leave it off the ground, your group may want to get into this level with the, as a lobby group. It gives you the experience on, as this project is being evolving, you know how to scoop up this data for the future reference. Secondly, maybe you can also inject your idea into the city so that they could limit, any more of these abuses happening. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah, and I think I'll just say that that's what we're hoping that people who've been working hard in the sector will take up and continue to take up, and that we can provide a support. So I think we don't know enough about housing, I guess, to be the participate in that way, but we know a bit about data sets and integrating data and enough about the market to contribute to this.
Okay.
Awesome. We're going to close out the Q&A, and we're going to stop recording very shortly.